Hello, hello. Welcome to another Angular Air. Good to see. We already have people waiting in the chat. It is good to see you all on this happy Friday. Hopefully it's a happy Friday for you. My name is Alyssa Nichol, and today with me I have the amazing Mike this way. He's down here. Say, Mike, how are you doing today?
Exceptionally well. I got my daughter who was just in here leaving, like pumping me up. So I'm doing real well.
We have fans waiting for this episode on all parts, in person and online. Excellent. And today our guests are Justin Schwartzenberger, who's usually a panelist, but we're putting him in the hot seat today, literally the hot seat. You'll see why. Justin, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Very well. Excited for this show. And we also have Jeff Welpley. An easy one to.
Hello.
It's good to see your face again, Jeff. How you doing?
Good to see all of you guys. It's been a little while.
Oh, excellent. So Justin, I wonder if you could kick us off with, I think it was like, I want to say like a month and a half ago, we were having a discussion and I was like, can we please make this an episode? Can you like refresh my brain on what were we talking about? Because I think it was actually right after an episode and Justin was like, I got some hot takes for you. And I was like, could you give them to me live on air maybe?
Yeah. I at some point, I think we were talking about the inject function, or it came up, or there was some code that we were looking at, or somebody's demo had that in there, right? And I think I was just kind of going, I have some opinions on that. And, you prodded me, you're like, oh, really? Hot takes? I'm like, I don't know if they're hot takes or not, but
you even made sexy slides.
Oh, man, I told you in the Slack, I said, these things are popping off. I can't wait. I'm excited. And I mean, I used some template in Canvas, so it's like, I didn't make all these graphics, but yeah, I think it came together pretty good.
You need some animations in there, Justin.
Really?
Oh, there are. Yeah. Oh, I know. Spoilers. I think there's one on the first one, but I don't know how to get it to load on the first one. So whatever, we're going to pretend that it animated. And so we do, right? But whatever. Hey, before we get started, I want to give a shout out to Jeff for people of viewers that might not have been around with us for a long time. Jeff used to be the host of this show and run Angular Air. So like he said, it's a long time ago. This thing's been going on for a long time. I don't know how many years. You might know how many years?
Can we estimate? Jeff, do you know?
It's been like 10 years.
I don't know. Be.
It's been longer than that.
Yeah.
It was
no way. Not longer than 10. Wait, what? What was it pre-Angular?
It was still Angular Air, but there was AngularJS content prior to Angular.
Oh, right. Okay.
So we got to go back.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds crazy to say that it's been 10 years, but I'm pretty sure it has been. Like, COVID like screws with your thinking of like how long things were. Like certain things were way longer, certain things were way shorter. So, but it was fun hosting, and I'm glad to be back to talk about this because this is a topic that I have a lot of thoughts on, and I'm sure you guys do as well.
Oh, awesome. I'm excited. I'm also nervous because you know what comes with hot takes.
Yeah, you're nervous. I mean,
an angry mob.
I'm like a supportive type of person, right? I'm like, should I take a hot take on some of this stuff? I don't know. It's kind of out of my nature, but I figure, hey, it's time to live a little. So
I've never known Justin to try to upset people. So I'm sure whatever arguments he has are well thought out, and he's willing to hear the counterpoints.
And even if you don't end up on the right side of this, right? Like at least you're.
How about we say the same side versus the right side?
Same side. It's good to know at least the other, the counterpoint, right? The argument of why
the key with a good hot take isn't whether it's right or wrong. It's just that you say it very strongly and definitively. So as long as you do that,
you're all good. I'm gonna fail. I can't do the hot take in that way. I will be very accommodating in my hot take. So I don't know, but that's just who I am. So it's my spin on the hot take. How about that?
Chaos Monster said, scrolling through the videos to the first video, you see the young Uri and Nil and many more. Yeah, that was a while ago.
How long ago is that on the first video, if you don't mind?
Yeah, let us know. Also, Bill said that he's already mad. So I love Bill Odom. My sister, she came to, it was like an event in London, and I can't remember the name of the event, but she came to help me because I had a newborn, and she met a lot of my friends, right? And Zach, my husband, whenever she got home, was like, "So, what people did you meet? Who's Alyssa's coolest friend?" And she was like, "Bill Odom." And I was like, "Wow, Bill, like, impressed." So to this day, she still asks how you are, Bill. So
Nice.
Oh, all right. Let us know, Chaos Monster. Angular Connect. Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Your brain, amazing brain. I am so excited though to hear some of these hot takes and some of the stories and the reasons behind them.
All right, let's do it then. So the Angular inject function, we're going to take a little journey through this, right? So here comes the animation. Boom, right? What's the inject function? Nice. So it's this function that we can get from Angular/core, right? And the official definition is it injects a token from the currently active injector. Make sense? I mean, that's clear, right? I don't know, but crazy. So let's actually talk about maybe what that means, right? But to do that, we really kind of need to talk about dependency injection as a whole. So let's talk about dependency injection. Really in dependency injection, I kind of see three core things, right? The first part is we need to register a type and an implementation. So when we talk about like a service, we need to register that, hey, our application or our code needs to be aware that this service is a thing and there's an implementation for that thing, right? The number two is this concept of a provider that handles instance management, right? So the provider is responsible for instantiating an instance of that thing and providing it when we need it. And then the final piece would be the injector, which provides the instance. So the injector is where we say, hey, we need an instance of that thing, Mr. DI, Mrs. DI, give it to me. And the injector will provide that to you. And then you can use that from there, right? So really three parts. I think I did two, but I mean three parts to the dependency injection kind of concept, right? All right. So let's talk about how Angular does dependency injection. So we'll go through some of these scenarios here, right? So you can see on the top side, we got number 1 and 2. So those first things where we're talking about register and the provider handling, the instance. So we talked about route providers. Little note there about ng modules. No, you still use them, whatever. But in the route providers, when we talk about defining a route, right, we can use this provider's property. And in the provider's property, we can tell the route provider, hey, we have this music player service, right? So we're making the dependency injection aware that there's this type and there's an implementation of it. And we're making the provider aware that, hey, you need to deal with this thing. So get ready for handling that, right? We have component providers, right? So at the component decorator, there's a provider's property there. And we can tell, component provider, hey, here's my music player service. Be aware of it and get ready for it, right? And then we have at our actual, service level, the actual instance of the or the implementation of the class, we can do the @injectable decorator, and we can say provided in root, and that's another way for us to tell the dependency injection system, hey, this is a thing you need to be aware of, a type you need to be aware of, and here's the implementation for it. So get ready to do your thing, right? And then we have provider dependencies or deps, right? Or we can talk about kind of doing 1, 2, and 3. So we can kind of think of this, typically we do this kind of like an app bootstrap, right? Where we might say, hey, here's a provider. So we can do it anywhere where we provide the providers array, but we're saying, hey, we're giving you an object literal. We're saying provide this service, in this case, like player service. So we're saying, hey, here's the type and here's the implementation. And then we're telling the provider, here, use this factory function when you go to instantiate an instance of that thing. And so use factory is like, here's the function, I want you to do your work. And then with the deps property, we're saying, hey, we want the dependency injection engine to pass some stuff to this factory function so that our factory function can do the work to instantiate another type, right? And so the deps is saying, hey, this player service needs to have an instance of music player service and video player service. So why don't you pass that along and do all your magic, DI, and make it all happen, right? So we kind of get all the worlds happening there, all the steps 1, 2, and 3 happening there from a dependency injection standpoint. And then, so that's the, kind of like the 1 and the 2. Anybody want to jump in, have any comments or anything before I move to kind of like how we start getting those dependencies?
No, I think that covers all the ways to basically, as you talked about in the initial slide, the registration to basically say, hey, these are the things that I'm making available.
Yep. I think somebody in chat mentioned token. So like injection token, like that's another thing. It's kind of similar to what we see on the screen here. So if we define an injection token, we could, use it in this sort of scenario here, or we could have the injection token have a factory function that would kind of do the similar sort of thing, right? Okay, cool. So we talk about the number 3, where we're talking about the injector. We're saying, hey, we need it. Dependency injection, provider, give us one of these things, right? I don't know how you did it, but give it to me. I'm going to need it, right? So we can do that through constructor injection. So let's say we have a class that we define, and in the constructor, we can say, hey, this constructor needs this music player service, and in Angular, I don't have it in the slide, but we would decorate this class with add injectable, and that would help Angular and the dependency injection know, hey, when this class gets instantiated, you need to provide it the music player service instance that it needs. Right. All right. So that's kind of how, without the inject function, how we do dependency injection in the Angular world, right? So let's talk about using the actual inject function and how that comes into play.
And inject is how old? Do you guys remember? The inject function.
10 years old. No, I don't know.
Is she old? Is she ancient? Has she been around for freaking ever?
I think version 15 was it?
Okay, so not early.
I'm using it in 14, so it's at least 14.
Okay.
Years. She's at least 14 years versions old. Wait, no.
Wait.
Yeah, 14.
No.
At least 14.
So a couple versions ago.
It's a hard,
relatively recent.
Relatively recent. Yeah. Yeah, Chaos Monster mentioned wasn't exposed for 14. I think that might have been the case, right? That like it became something that we could start using in 14. It was there for a little while, right?
I think there was a bug that caused it not to be able to be used, and that bug was actually fixed, and I think that's what actually exposed it.
Because it was a weird timing, because I was like, the hype has not been here since 14. So that's why, Mike. Okay. I am
14.2. I want to say 14.2, but I may be wrong.
We need a research department. Can we call the research department? Hey, can you look that up, please?
Phone a friend. We need to phone a friend. Yeah.
All right. So using the inject function, right? So when we talk about a class constructor body, right? So we looked at this player component class, right? In our constructor, we can, in our class, we can have a class field called music player service. In our constructor, we can use this inject function to say, hey, give me the music player service instance. And that will, provide that similar way that we did it in constructor injection, right? But we're using the inject function instead. We'll have some discussion around this a little later, but you can kind of start seeing how like, okay, now our constructors can kind of get, the constructor statement that we have gets kind of cleaner, right? And it's more, we're dealing with it within the body. So that starts kind of be kind of cool. I mean, if you think about, you start getting a class that has 13, properties, arguments that have to come in, your constructor definition gets pretty long or whatever. Well, we can take it a little further and we can actually do class field initializer. So we could make that music player service class field set equal to inject music player service. Reason this works is because it's really happening at instantiation, right? So anything that happens at this class instantiation, which if we kind of trace back, this class is getting registered with dependency injection saying, hey, be aware of this class. So it's really in the dependency injection workflow. That's kind of why the inject works at that point, if that makes sense. Okay.
Do people hate constructors? Is that where this is coming from? Where is this stemming from? Like the desire to do what you just showed. No?
Well, there's a lot of reasons. I mean, so I think it's before talking about using it in a component. I mean, there's lots of cases where they were really annoying when people were trying to just use a function somewhere else that it wasn't within a class, that this is like super, super useful for. But then, you know, once it's, so for that alone, it becomes, you know, really useful. And then it becomes a debate on within a typical component class, what is nicer, or the pluses and minuses of the different approaches.
I see. Okay.
And Mugatu mentioned, you know, that one of the main benefits using injectors is the ability for Angular compiler to use tree shaking when running the application. So that's another, you know, kind of thing that it can help out with potentially, you know, having more understanding from the Angular compiler side to understand like how to tree shake more code away, sort of thing. All right, so provider factory function. So that example where we're talking about, we're setting up a provider, we're giving it an object literal, we're saying provide this type, right? And we're using a factory. In our factory function, we could do something like use the inject function here. So you can see it kind of start maybe getting us to where we don't need to do that depths property and kind of chain things. You can start say, hey, look, my use factory is going to do this inject and kind of do all those sort of things. Again, because we're doing something at the time that dependency injection is doing its work, this starts to play out and is available, right? There are cases where we start thinking, well, can I just use the inject function all the way down? Turtles everywhere, right? You can't, because it kind of has to run in this context of when dependency injection is doing its thing, I guess. That makes sense. But you can see it's kind of like some of the benefits of the inject function is that we can start kind of writing what feels like a little bit cleaner code, right? And you can start seeing it like, hey, look, this is a function that we've declared at this use factory. So we could potentially move that out into maybe a reusable bit and start, you know, organizing things a little more, you know, cleaner and things like that, and maybe more reusable. Of course, the caveat, and we'll discuss that later, is the fact that you have to understand that it has to run during this dependency injection time, right, in order for it to work. All right, so then like other places that do DI stuff, right? So that's kind of what I was referring to. So for example, like a can activate route guard. Again, you know, during the route definition, we're setting up things where dependency injection is ready to be listening and saying, hey, help, I'm ready. Like, tell me what to do. And so in a route definition, we can have a can activate function. And so that can activate function, the logic inside of there, we can do things like use the inject function to get services and things that we need, or instances that we need, and then do logic off of that, right? Kind of a cool thing with the can activate function that we see here, right? I think a lot of us probably started, if you're doing can activates or route guards, making classes, right? And then we have the whole classes and we have the whole constructor and all that stuff. And that's why we did dependency injection for those things that we need to use in our can activate logic. And as we kind of move towards the ability to do these can activate functions, and the inject function kind of bridges that gap to make it easier for us to say, hey, we need this logic. We need some dependencies. We don't have a class. So how do we get those dependencies? Well, we can just call this inject function and get them. We don't need to rely on just constructor injection. So that's, I think, where some of the parts where the inject function really starts to shine, is this kind of leaning into more like functional programming where you want to do that. Now you have a way to get dependencies injected, and you don't have to always, you know, default to going to a class to do that. All right, so I just want to make a reminder here, right, that this inject function, we're getting it from Angular core, right? And what does that mean? Okay, you know, we're getting it from Angular core. That means it's an Angular provided thing, right? So if we're using it, we are doing Angular things. We are coupling to doing Angular things. So first hot take, Angular is for SPA routing and DOM data and event binding, full stop. And I have my discuss there. So that's, you know, we could talk about it. So this is me being accommodating, right, to my hot take.
Right.
when I talk about this, I'm really, talking about, when I think about it, I think about what is Angular really providing me value for, and what is the stuff that doesn't have to be Angular specific. And so I kind of break it down into, well, the routing for a single page app, and and there's some things there that could also go out. And then DOM, event binding, data binding, when we want to bind that stuff to the DOM. Everything else, to me, from my experience, I look at it and go, I don't necessarily need Angular to be responsible for it. Thoughts?
My first question, can you go back to the previous slide? I think it's the previous slide.
This one?
No, one more.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
I'm sorry.
This one?
This one. So I haven't had the need to write any route cards. Is it possible to put the logic from line 4 in between 2 and 3, whereas it is actually a parameter to the function versus inside of the actual function?
Wait, what?
So it's like a default parameter, right? Default value for the parameter.
Yeah.
I don't know if I tried that or not, but it's on my bucket list to try. Okay. I don't have an answer for you offhand because I can't remember if I tried it or not. I got a lot of things going on in my life. I don't know.
The reason why I ask is one of the things that I really like about Angular's dependency injection is it makes testing very easy, even without using testbed for either for components or services or what have you. You say, hey, I want to new something up, and when I call new, I get it's a function, so I can pass in those parameters and mock out whatever I want to mock so that I can isolate what I want. In this instance here, I don't have that ability. But if I were to be able to move line 4 to be as a parameter to the function, then I kind of get around that.
So that's actually something that will fall into another hot take that I have coming up later.
Dang it, Mike.
I
Dang it.
You jumped ahead.
Jumping ahead.
That's exactly, that's one of the things I want to talk about. And I actually don't have a slide about talking about testing, but I was hoping we talk about it. So that's great. So store that, put that away. That's coming up. Let me go back to my slide that I had up.
Wait, well, before you move this, hold on.
Okay.
One
Wanna
other
go back
thing.
to it? Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
No
I was
worries.
just going to mention one side point on this is that you mentioned functional programming, but I just want to point out that true functional programming is kind of integral to dependency injection. Like you would never have dependency injection with quote unquote true functional programming.
You wouldn't?
Because there's no there's no, you don't want to have a global scope of anything. Like everything is passed in. So true functional programming is a pain in the ass in my opinion. Because it's true. Like if you try to build a large system,
right.
Like people do this with I forgot the name of the language that's all functional programming, but you end up passing stuff down through layer and layer, and it's it's a real pain. So DI solves a big problem. So anyways, that was just a side point. But yeah, you can go ahead to the
I think along those lines, I think about it everything I think about in tech, it's not an all or nothing for me when I look at solutioning, right? It's always how is this going to help me here? How's this going to help me there? Mm-hmm. So I think what Mike brought up in terms of, could we get this into the parameter and make it a default value? Now you're setting up where, hey, this function bit is functional, right? And maybe I still have an orchestrator that does DI, but now I have smaller bits of functions that can be here's the thing you need to work with, rather than that function understands how to get what it needs to work with, right?
Yep. Yeah, definitely.
I have questions on your hot take, Shorty. Also, Jeff,
right,
I love that you just are ripping all the Band-Aids off, and it's just there are no hot takes off limit today. Tell us which Star Wars you love the most, right?
Empire Strikes Back. That's a new one.
So, can you tell me the flip side of this coin? Because I feel like you're being really safe with the wording here. So what is it? What is it not?
I said full stop. Is that not strong enough? It's nothing else, right?
Right, but what are people doing with Angular that you're twitching at?
Not okay. So you know me. It's I'm not twitching at anything. I totally understand. Every situation is different. Every solution is different. let's be building solutions that fit what we need, right? Just from my journey, as I've gone through it all and seen it, I start to kind of realize and breaking down that I see that's like, there's a lot of stuff I can do code wise that doesn't need to be necessarily coupled to Angular, that then makes it more portable, that I can use it beyond. So I spend a lot of time building multiple apps, right? In a mono repo and sharing code. So I think about presentational components that are reused beyond apps, whether they're Angular apps or React apps or whatever, business logic type of code that's in a service, calling a network call or processing some business logic. There's nothing Angular specific about that. So if I can make it more portable, it's easy, and I can consume it in Angular, then I can consume it in a React app. I can consume it in a native app, like all these things, right? So this is where this is really coming from, is trying to understand, like, I love what Angular can do. How can I think about the things that don't need to be tightly coupled to Angular, so it's easier to reuse those things in other places?
So I don't know if this is necessarily where you're totally going with this, but maybe I'm going to take it a step further, because I do generally agree with what you're saying here, and trying to focus Angular on what it's good at and that type of thing. Like, there is a take. What's the server side framework that uses a lot of Angular constructs? Like, is it Nest or I don't use it, but like there's
Nest.
a server side.
I think it's Nest, right?
Okay, yeah. So like, the whole concept of Nest is that you're utilizing similar like decorators and the same type of injection and whatever else, because like you're used to this in the front end and using the back end or whatever. And I get that way of thinking, but like this is sort of contrary to that, right? And I'm more with this way of thinking, that like, rather than taking things that kind of Angular kind of popularized, decorators and injection in the constructors and some things that aren't kind of universal JavaScript, it's an opinion or whatever else. So whatever, but I'm on your side, that like, you use the sort of more universal JavaScript stuff, like non-Angular stuff, for as much as you can, and kind of keep the Angular stuff for where it's kind of focused and good at. So I think that's what you're trying to say with this, right?
Yeah, totally. That's exactly it.
Is there a more universal JavaScript approved way of doing dependency injection?
There are other ways, right?
That don't involve Angular?
Yeah.
What?
There's also the hybrid. There's also an hybrid approach as well, that you can use Angular dependency injection without using Angular. And one of our recent guests.
Are you talking analog? This one?
No.
Something else. What are you talking about?
I'm talking about, I believe it's called Injectable as an NPM package, where Minko went into Angular and took all of Angular's dependency injection and ripped it out as a completely separate library.
I see.
You guys are predicting the future of my slides, so I love it.
Oh, jeez.
It's great. You're asking. No, this is the conversation I wanted to have, and I'm so happy that I have answers or
Oh yeah.
Keys,
but like
to some of those discussions.
But the thing is with this, if you think about, so components are obviously something that falls under Angular, like the visual representation constructs for that. But like, if you separate out like with the other stuff, right? Like the services, like business logic code, that type of thing. That's the area where it's an open question of like how you want to set that up, and people take different approaches or whatever else. Like if you do it like the full Angular way, like everything is in the same Angular way, you're putting it all in these classes, right? That are injectable, that are like, do have the constructor, do all that stuff. But if you take it the other way, everything's kind of like, you could just have all functions that are, just not anything Angular related, and could be used on the server side, could be used other places. And there's plus and minuses to each of them. I'm not saying one is the better way per se, but.
So you mentioned components.
Alyssa looks really confused right now.
Well, it's just because you said classes so vehemently, but you already expressed your hatred of functions. So I'm like, what does he love? What does he love? I don't know.
So you notice I left out components in this statement, right? And there's a reason why I left that out, because I question, are components really, that tightly coupled to Angular? Angular uses components, right? And everything starts with a component, but do we, need to be thinking about, or maybe can we benefit of thinking about like everything all the way in the full DOM doesn't have to be an Angular component, right? And I think about web components and presentational components, and can those be web components that are rapidly shared between React apps and Vue apps or whatever, right? Or vanilla apps, those sort of things. So this leads great into my next slide. Let me click on it. There we go.
I was like, what is it?
So I kind of start thinking about the Angular zone, no pun intended, right? No relation, and the vanilla zone, right? And so when I think about the Angular zone, I start thinking about bootstrapping the app. We talk about the SPA control there, right? We talk about routing. So we talk about the SPA routing, right? And then, page components, quote unquote, page components. And these are kind of like these top level components that represent the orchestration of the view, right? And that's where I see, the things living in Angular, things we need to do data binding and event binding and things like that kind of orchestrate that fit within the SPA app and the routing and things like that, right? And then to me, everything else really becomes in this vanilla zone. I call it the vanilla zone. It could be whatever zone, right? But non-Angular coupled zone, right? So when we talk about services, yeah, Angular provides HTTP service, right? But do we need HTTP service to be doing the network calls? So we have to have Angular specific things to do network calls, or can we accomplish that without it, right?
Does
Logic
Angular
stuff.
get pissy if you don't?
I don't know. I haven't asked it.
Oh, okay.
So I just do things. No, I don't know. No, like fetch, I don't know if we've talked about it on the show, but like fetch is now starting to become an option and a thing to use within our Angular apps and things like that, right? But even kind of like the concept of the HTTP service that Angular provides, we get that from Angular. Like, I don't know if we can really decouple that and use that independently. Like if I was to think and say, hey, I have this service that does this HTTP call and I want to use it in this other app that's not Angular, can I just use it and bring that and import that? Or now am I like, well, now I have to take on Angular as a dependency in that other app in order to use that just because I'm using the HTTP service under the hood, right? So starting to think about those sort of things, decoupled from Angular, if that makes sense.
One thing, by the way, although it is useful to think of like, part of the motivation for decoupling is because, you could use it in non-Angular stuff and whatever else. I've actually found that, which is true, but I've also found that the other thing is that it's just easier for new developers who aren't familiar with the code base to learn, usually when it is more universal JavaScript than kind of Angular specific. Like generally speaking, like there's no like special tricks to learn and that type of thing. They can just like read the code and kind of understand it. I guess depending on you could always write bad code or whatever. But no, I think generally speaking, like it is easier for new developers to learn stuff when it's more generic
and less framework specific you're talking about.
Yep.
I couldn't agree more. And I actually gave a talk about this about a year ago, maybe a little bit less than that, about writing less framework specific code, just generally speaking, to say that the one thing that hasn't changed in browsers over the last 20 plus years is JavaScript. So the more you can write that isn't tightly coupled with a framework that you can extract out makes it reusable. So sure, a lot of us here have been using Angular for 10 years, and that's great that we've been able to have that type of consistency with our code. But what happens when Angular isn't the answer? Or if Angular isn't the answer in 5, 10, 15 years or whatever? Does all the effort that you have and you've invested in writing Angular specific code, does that get thrown away? Do you have to recreate that when the one constant has been JavaScript?
I just worry about what happens, like not so much about Angular's feelings, but more like, does stuff with the life cycle get messed up because we like are trying to do as much as possible outside of Angular? Like, I guess it's my worry of like, I don't know.
If you think about a framework like Angular, as the glue that you're using to bind together all of your logic, then that becomes less of a concern. If that logic lives elsewhere, then I don't really like, for example, the idea of mapping data that's coming from a server. And if you can take that logic and put it into a function in it, just a .ts file, nothing imported from Angular, nothing else. This is the logic of how I take something that's shaped like this to something that's shaped like that. And it becomes a pure function, which means there's no other factors applied to the function, just whatever you give it. Thank you. About to same statement. That it's reusable. So I don't care if you're going to use it inside the context of an RxJS observable, if you're going to use it in React from calling something with fetch or Axios or whatever it is, that logic will stay the same and is pertinent because it's your business logic and has nothing to do with the framework.
And we can test it and we can manage that code a lot easier because we can do JavaScript type things around it, right? We don't have any other dependency. We don't have to start up a test framework. We don't have to worry about, things like dependency injection and things that work in a different way. Like we have, it's easier to kind of maintain that code over time, right? I think ultimately it's, it's having this, trying to project into the future of what you're building and think, like, for me, I always think about it like what can I do right now to lay the foundation that prepares for a changing future, which always happens, right? And how can, and Mike, you mentioned it, right? Like, how can we be aware of potentials and start laying foundation so that if that happens, it's an easier lift or we can get to that solution if that comes down the road, right? So certainly, and it's just all situational based, right? In terms of what you're building and what your needs are, right? From a business standpoint, like maybe it's all Angular all the time and you have one app and like totally fine, right? None of this is like, there's one way to do it. It's just like, these are the things I kind of think about in terms of doing this architecture from multiple apps and things. And like, how can kind of start getting to things to be aware of that can set us up for success for these different scenarios, right? Bill mentioned that, like, in his opinion, Angular and web components is an awkward combo as much as he'd love to be it otherwise, right? I totally agree. And he mentioned the fact that Minko was on here, and I asked that question about more web component support in the future for Angular, and it was kind of not so much of a priority. This is where I see that, like, it would be nicer to start getting some more support for web components in this world where, at that component level, we're really talking about presentational things, and we can do a lot of building there that's reusable and shareable outside of an Angular app, but still consumable in an Angular app if we start getting kind of more of the ecosystem of Angular having some more support. And I think a lot of it, for what I've seen, comes around like tooling and things, like when we get into our editors and understanding, the things that's like, does it recognize this element? And, how can we get it to say, hey, look, understand this is a web component that I have built in my library and I can navigate to it and things like that.
Because I was going to ask what is barring the way for web components to work well with Angular? Is it just tooling? Like, there's nothing actually like incompatible about using a web component in an Angular app? Like,
yeah, you have to do the custom schema. You have to tell Angular, hey, I'm allowing custom schema, so don't be on the lookout for native elements and only Angular elements. Like let everything else fly, right? Because I have these web components that have their element names. And right now it's kind of like an all or nothing. You're like, just ignore all the schema. And then I think at that point, that's where things start to kind of fall apart, because now we don't have the tooling and stuff that kind of helps understand that, oh, this is a web component in my Angular template, right? Sort of thing. So for me, hopefully that's something that start kind of finding its way in and we can get that. And I think kind of start bridging, adding more of these opportunities, right, for the vanilla zone.
And yeah, that's a different level of pushing things away from framework specific. I'm more concerned with the logic in the JavaScript and rendering HTML or putting together HTML strings for the browser is a little bit, to me, that I consider that separate from your pure logic that lives in JavaScript. But it's the same concept of taking things from being framework specific to being generic.
And actually, bring this back to the inject function. I guess one of the key things with what you're talking about is, at that kind of lowest of your component tree level, you have dumb components like at the kind of leaf level that ideally would be generic web components. But even if you have it in Angular, either way, I think the key is, in an ideal world, you wouldn't actually be injecting too much additional stuff like into that lowest level. It should almost be like passed in like because it's supposed to be dumb and everything like that, that you're just passing in, more primary variables, strings and numbers and everything like that. That if it was, because if you do make a generic web component, like you don't want it to have a lot of downstream dependencies.
Right. All right, next hot take. Can we bring our own DI to, or decouple DI from Angular? So we talked about this a little bit earlier. So let's discuss that. I think that's one of the wishes I have would be that, hey, can DI be outside of Angular? So now I can do non-Angular type of DI stuff, or essentially leverage DI in that business logic or that other services code that's not coupled to Angular, so I can ship it and use it other places, right?
Yeah, what were the you guys mentioned there was a show where you guys talked about actually taking the Angular DI and trying to separate it out. What are the challenges with doing that? I'm not even sure why you can't theoretically create a separate library from the way it does it. Maybe is it kind of the way it's currently implemented too intertwined with other Angular core stuff?
Well, one of the things that jumps out to me is like when I create a class, right, that's going to do some logic. If it's going to be using dependency injection, I have to decorate it with that injectable, right? Which is an Angular thing. So like if I had an added injectable that came from a, independent library or a library, it could come from Angular too, that stands on its own, right? That only does dependency injection. But I could decorate my classes and say, hey, they're for the dependency injector, but it's nothing Angular specific. Then I can easily, use that and drop that into another app that's using the same dependency injection system.
Is it this one is by Minko, the NPM package you're talking about, injection.js? Do you think it's that one?
That sounds right.
Okay.
If it's from Minko, yes.
I'm going to share it in the chat. So, because I know, Justin, you'd mentioned that he already kind of packaged it up, so it could be its own.
Yeah. So, to me, I see that that's a, potential solution. Again, getting to the, thing that I'm looking at in terms of, I want to be able to write these, quote unquote, business logic type of classes in JavaScript code that are framework agnostic that I can easily reuse. Right. But I still want to leverage the awesomeness of dependency injection, depending on what fence you're on that. But I like dependency injection. So I want to be able to utilize that, but without having it, be an Angular thing, so I can port it and use it other places.
Yeah, in terms of creating separate, to Bill's point, sorry, can you bring that back up?
Mike, Bill's.
Okay, I got it. The idea of how, if you're writing all of your logic separately, and therefore not in a service, therefore you're creating an extra file or files, do you create a class in that as your generic TypeScript, or do you do functions that you would have pass-through functions? How to structure that, as well as using potential dependencies inside of those pure functions. If I need an HTTP mechanism, do I pass that into the function, or at what level do you assume something's global?
Challenges, right? Challenges to think about. But I think worthwhile to take the time. I think that that's one of the things I see a lot is a lot of developers, we jump right to building the solution. And there's so much value that I see in terms of taking the time and taking, a breath and relaxing and really thinking it through. When I do stuff, I spend a lot of time thinking several things through. I play the whole thing out and really work things out in my head and think through. And then by the time I go to write code, like I'm just boom, boom, boom fast because I've already solutioned it out throughout my head. So I spend a lot of time up front thinking about that and thinking about scenarios. And I think that's valuable to take that time, right?
So you're one of those chess players that are like, can actually think 10 moves ahead. Cause I cannot. I have to like, oh, I think I have an idea. And then I like write the code and then I see it and then I can see the next step. But like, I cannot do that mapping in my brain. I wish I could hold them, like the variables in place. And I don't know. It's amazing that you can. I feel like there's different like types of brains out there and not all of us are very gifted.
I think like to me, everything to me is like experience, right? Like I've had, 25 plus years of building enterprise and shipping enterprise development software. And so for me, have had the experiences, right, that have gone down the road of saying like, look, this thing comes up and you weren't ready for it, right? And so I guess I'm, learned over time, part of a defense mechanism to really be thinking, okay, I need to project out all potential scenarios. So before we start taking this on, like, have I thought about everything that could happen? Because again, in code, it only does what we tell it when we write it to do, right? Like it's not gonna. Someday maybe with AI it'll think on its own, but right now it's like we're saying, hey, you need to do this, and so if a scenario comes along and it's not written to handle it, things are going to fall apart potentially. So I think from my experience and just defense mechanism, I'm constantly trying to think about what if they do this? What if a user clicks this and types this value in here? So my mind gravitates towards that first. So I think it's just a learned thing.
I find parallels between this conversation about framework specific stuff and non-framework specific stuff very similar to the conversation we had last week with Alyssa's husband about dependencies and weighing the costs of what you're doing and having the ability to step back. We even got into the part of the conversation that was whether or not you should use a framework at all, and going all the way out to should I even use a framework for just a static site? And then now this is kind of a little bit deeper that, hey, I've decided to use a framework, and how much of the framework should I be using?
And actually, along those lines, one thing I'm thinking about is with this question of like, why would you want to bring DI out of Angular in the first place? And like, or why would you want to use DI? Like you try to like even take a step back from what we're talking about. And because for just using a dependency, obviously you could just import a module from like another file, right? So like there's the reason why, I mean, there's a couple different reasons, but like in Angular, so testing, which we'll talk about in a second. So like it makes testing easier, which we don't have to dive into fully now. But also with Angular, it helps with the various situations where you do at runtime or because of the context want to switch out what the actual downstream dependencies are. So like for me, I use it a lot with server-side code, like where you have a different dependency on the server side versus the client side, and DI helps tremendously, with that. But that's like a front-end specific thing, which makes sense to be in Angular. So like for me, and maybe I'm not thinking about something, it'd be interesting if you guys think of something else, but like the reasons to bring DI out of Angular, it's mostly testing. Like is there anything else that you guys can think of?
So I think it's testing, right? But I think it's also the inject function, right? Like, and when we talk about using the inject function, that comes from Angular, and that's a Angular dependency injection. So if we have that in the middle of our classes, then we are coupled to Angular. And if we port those somewhere else, like that code needs to bring in Angular, right? So I think that's where I look at it from a dependency injection standpoint. And that's how I got to this kind of discussion point here during this talk about inject, is because I think that starts to come into play. Is that, again, remember it inject comes from at Angular core.
I'm wondering if there's a way to almost, because to the point that Bill made earlier about creating thin wrappers, that allows you to have your implementation separate from something that gets provided to Angular. And if there was a way almost to source your registrations from an external dependency injection library, maybe injection.js from Minko or something like that, to basically say on application startup, of Angular to say, hey, here's my dependencies. When you new things up, these are my associations. These are the tokens that I need, which will allow you to have your portability of your dependency injections separate, and keeping the ideas of your logic separate from a given framework, because the dependency injection configuration is also part of that. But then you have to worry down the road, am I going to run into an application set that does not have dependency injection? In which case you might have to write some sort of interop to be able to get to that point. It's a balance of how much you utilize a framework and how much you go off on your own to write just TypeScript, or only TypeScript, just as has some counterweights to it.
I really didn't want to do a hot take show, right? Because it's not really my persona, but I'm so happy that we did, because everybody here on the panel, all of our people in the chat, like, this discussion is great. Everybody's bringing up all these different things that are so many great things to think about and to explore. And so I'm very excited to, this talk helping facilitate those discussions and those thought processes. And so for me, that's totally, I love it. So
I don't want to necessarily say that the inject function is bad. It has its purposes and what have you. With a lot of the things that have been happening within the Angular ecosystem and with the team and the changes that have been made to the framework, the writing has kind of been on the wall that the idea of functional components is a possibility. Timing, I don't know. I'm not even speculating, but it looks like the writing is on the wall that it is a possibility. In which case, in order to use dependency injection in that type of world, the injection function becomes a little bit more necessary. But it's just a matter of how do you use it to enable still strong testability and dependency injection.
So that's where I say I'm going to be chilling with my inject use, to kind of balance out like how I'm going to tackle, leaning into inject and leaning, out of it, I guess. So another hot take: use the inject when doing Angular things, hard pass in other places.
Wait, what's an Angular thing? Like, back to the routing and the DOM manipulation, or are we?
Yep.
Wait, okay.
So the Angular zone versus the vanilla zone.
Vanilla zone,
yeah. So when we talk about the Angular zone, my Angular zone is app bootstrap, routing, page level components. Use that inject function, because those are all things to me that are Angular specific, right? So couple away, you're doing all those things, right? And then fall back to doing constructor injection for my services, the business logic, that sort of thing. Like Mike mentioned earlier, we have a way to test services. Even though we decorate it with that injectable, we still have a way to test services with constructor injection in a non-Angular way, right? We can instantiate a service, pass another instantiated or mock thing as well. And so to me, that feels like I can still get kind of closer to a vanilla world, right, with my business logic type of things.
I raised my hand. So mentioning the HTTP stuff, Angular stuff and a service kind of has a blurred lines if you're using Angular's HTTP library inside of a service that you're trying to say is separate from Angular. So what is your hot take or cool take or your take and suggestion of how to get around that beast?
Cool take.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't have an answer yet identified for that. I mean, I see scenarios where, like, let's say I have another library. I got an example, like I have another library that's actually doing the network calls, right? And I'm bringing that other library in. And now that's just a TypeScript or JavaScript based library. Now I'm using that in my services. Now I'm not doing any HTTP calls from my services. I'm using this other external library to do those, network calls, which is not Angular specific. And so, that's one way, easy way to get around it, right? But the other way is really kind of, you just got to start figuring out, like, how does that? And I think, again, we talked about, fetch coming into play. You talked about Axios and things like that. Like maybe started looking at like, do I do my HTTP stuff in kind of more of a vanilla or Angular decoupled way?
Bill's cracking me up. I've passed HTTP client instance into non-Angular code, but I felt guilty the whole time.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, these are challenges, right? These are architectural challenges that we can think about. I think the important thing, like for me, what I was trying to do is I try and have those on my mind, right? They don't always, what I identify doesn't always dictate the final solution I go with. But for me, I really want to know the lay of the land. I want to know like everything about everything before I make a decision about what I'm going to write. So for me, it's just, and Bill mentioned it earlier, talking about like, if you try and predict all the future, it's a lot of things. Like I try and just digest as much of the potential future as possible to allow that to help me make decisions on which way I'm going to go in the now. And I think that's kind of,
as like a Sith in nature, I'm very like all or nothing. Is there any point to using the inject function? Can we just constructor injection everything and then I'm on the safe side, right? Like,
yeah, so it's a great question. Like I don't see it as like a safe side or a one or the other thing you got to do, or what somebody might call like a quote unquote best practice. I prefer to call them successful practices instead of best practices because every situation is different, and I don't know how one person is going to dictate that this is the only way to do things and it's considered best, right? So I still look at it in terms of again, going back to that, I'm trying to digest everything that's possible and help, having enough information to make an informative decision and live with that decision and be comfortable with that decision. All of us, it's going to be different. Your app is different. Your requirements, your business logic, the problems you're solving are different. So I'd hope that everybody feel comfortable that picking, you're going to land on something that's going to fit right for you and your situation. And that's totally fine. But if you empower yourself to understand these potentials and all these other things, then I think it'll help you maybe, find even more success in making those decisions.
This is an interesting question because I wasn't aware that class-based route guards were deprecated. I thought it was just the ability to write functional guards was added without necessarily removing the other feature.
was it deprecated?
I'm not positive.
Yeah,
I don't want to speculate either way, but I hadn't heard that they were.
Might Googling it. Fast Googling.
But yeah, I think
Angular. We need our Angular AI bot.
Right. Go search.
There's this quick thing that says deprecated. Class-based route guards are deprecated in favor of functional guards. And that was, when was this written? But it is in the Angular docs.
And so I think that's a great example of like the inject. Again, we talked about it earlier. Like if we get rid of, route guards as a class, well, how do you inject dependencies that your logic might need? Well, you use the inject function, right? And again, you're doing a route guard for a router, which is an Angular thing.
Angular
to
zone,
me,
yeah. Okay,
that
makes
feels
sense.
in the Angular zone, yeah. All right. So
one thing that really quick, Bill was asking about.
Oh yeah, I wanted to address that too.
Understanding of the direction that the team is taking, and I'm not sure I necessarily know about that, but because I haven't heard them say a specific thing for DI, but like just in a general sense, I always feel like they are trying to support like the largest breadth of different use cases and kind of see how things go. So like I do think with this, I'm going to guess based off of the many years that we've been working with the Angular team and whatever, is that they sort of see how the community, like there's something out there like the inject function, see what everybody does and how they uses it. And over time, it'll become clear because, as people develop new apps and everything like that, like one or another, like these types of discussions, very useful. It may be that maybe in another year or two, almost everybody is just using the inject, or maybe the other way that it's only for like very small niche cases or whatever. So I think I would think it's kind of unclear right now what the direction will be, but I don't know what you guys think.
I remember hearing one of the Angular team members, and I'm not 100% positive to who it was, so I don't want to mention any names, but it was somebody from the Angular team whose take was, we fixed a bug with the inject function. We don't really have any best guidance, but something that wasn't working is now working. If you want to use it, it now works. So I don't know if there is a direction around that at this point, but I don't know. There's definitely conflicting camps between whether or not to use it.
So Jeff, this is exactly why we did this episode. And Alyssa, you asked that earlier, like, how did we get to deciding to do this episode? That's it. Because we were seeing a lot of content that's out there right now that people are writing and going like, inject everywhere,
Lean all in on it. Yeah.
All in on it. Right. Yeah. And so we talked about wanting to have this episode to say, hey, let's have a discussion around that before we get to a point where that's the way to go. Right. And then even it goes into maybe like you're saying, like if Angular team is looking at the community and seeing this happening all over the place, does it all of a sudden get adopted? And now we're in a state where that's maybe not, flexible, right?
So that happens, right? Not just because it's like the one true way, but it's just because it's the way the community is doing it. So I like Justin's like, let's get on top of this before it.
I got some things to say. I want to make sure that we have this discussion. Like let's open this before I start having developers come to me and saying like, we're injecting with the inject function all the things. I'm like, whoa, did we think about that? Right? Or do we just read it right somewhere? So yeah.
This has been such a cool episode. Seriously, Justin, I'm so grateful for you putting this content together and sharing your hot takes with us today.
With the awesome slides.
Oh, yeah. The killer
slides. All right. I was excited as they come together. I always like dive into slides and I'm going, I don't know, but I know it's going to be sweet. And then as I start working into them, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm loving this.
Although, Justin, if I could give some constructive criticism, I do think you need more animation. Just as a general rule, more animation equals better.
All right, I hear that.
I hear that. I don't think I've ever been given that feedback because like there's so many times animations go wrong. So most people are like, please stop trying to do what you're doing. Like what?
So if that's the case, are you suggesting to use Angular animations or something separate?
Oh God.
That's another show. I have some takes on that.
Show. I think we all have some feelings on Angular animations.
Right.
Oh my gosh. So any last comments on the inject function, other hot takes before we get to picks? This was magnificent.
No, again, I just said, I'm glad that we're having this discussion. It's been so fun to be able to have all these points that are coming up, right? And things that people are thinking about. So the important part for me is that we're thinking about it and we're asking those questions and we're exploring those things before just, writing blog posts about inject all the things.
It's a little heartbreaking to hear though, the lack of love for maybe all that is DI and Angular, because I think it's one of like Angular's strongest points over other frameworks. And so to hear that it might not be a feature that's being used, I'm like, well, then why are we even using Angular?
Well, I love DI and I love the fact that Angular provides it, but I've just noticed now that I'm in a situation where like when I want to reuse that code that uses DI, I'm now kind of stuck. So how do I find a solution for that, right? And that's why this little inject function is like, okay, it's sweet, but now if I start embedding it in classes, now I'm really coupled to the dependency injection of Angular. So, I'm just trying to find a balance.
I love it. All right. Well, Mike, do you have any picks for us today? Putting you on the spot, making you go first.
I do. I have 2 picks.
Tell us.
Although I may steal Jeff's pick, so I'll wait on that one. But my one pick is that I do have snippets in VS Code named after Bill Odom. After his talk about CSS Grid a few years back at ngconf about CSS Grid, that I prefixed all my CSS Grid snippets with Bill Odom.
I remember you did that. That was dope. Does he know about that?
He does now.
Oh my my gosh. All right.
It's easier than going to look things up. Create snippets for yourself.
No, he said he's very honored. All right. Jeff, any picks for you today, darling?
Yeah, I was talking to Justin about this, but I am in the process of creating a new YouTube channel. It's basically going to be, it's called Tech Time Rewind. It is like, have you guys ever watched, many years ago, Behind the Music on VH1 back in the 90s?
Yes. Do we need to ask if everybody knows what VH1 is? Oh no, it's still around.
Oh, I know. Seriously. Anyways, so it's going to be a highly produced show. It won't be like kind of live like this. A look back at the kind of some seminal moments in tech industry. JavaScript are like the stuff that we've kind of experienced and whatnot. So the first show that I've already started working on is basically taking a look back at Shai Resnick's kind of triple of amazing talks 3 years in a row at NGConf with NG What, NG Show, and then NG Rap. And I'm kind of giving a half an hour condensed look back at the behind the scenes, what we thought, a whole bunch of stuff related to that. So it should be fun. Like I'm really looking forward to a lot of this. And as kind of a meta thing, next week I'm going to I'll tweet it out exactly when, but I've been working with this consultant to like help me set up like all that stuff. Like I haven't done like the lighting and like all this other like technical stuff that I thought might be interesting. People might be interested in some of the technical details of like setting up a show, and I thought I might help get some ideas for
that's so cool.
the things that I'm thinking of. So I'll let you guys know, like I'll tweet it out or something, then kind of invite people on for that. It'll be probably in the middle of next week. So
amazing. That sounds so cool, Jeff. Again, the name of the show is Tech Time Rewind.
Tech Time Rewind.
Perfect. Yep. Awesome. All right, Justin, I have no picks today. Do you have any picks for us?
I was trying to decide on what I was going to pick, and I was hoping that you had a pick or two. I had a little bit more time.
Then Jeff didn't pick the other pick that I had.
Oh, what is it,
so
Mike?
I can go back to that. I was leaving the door open. The Women's World Cup is going on. So if you get the chance, check that out. For those who may be in the U.S., the U.S. team plays tonight at 9 Eastern.
Nice. I'm going to pick something in the future because we're talking a lot about like thinking about the future and preparing for the future, right? So I'm going to pick the Ahsoka series. For the Star Wars
amazing
series.
Oh my god, I am
Ahsoka?
so pumped.
Yeah. So
you don't
you mentioned
all right, Alyssa, stop right now.
Stopping.
So
you don't know who Ahsoka is? Come on.
I know, right? So you mentioned about the favorite Star Wars movie, and I jumped on Empire right away. So Ahsoka is my favorite Star Wars character. I love her arc and her story.
Is she the one with
I can't wait.
The noodles for hair?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. See, Bill's actually helpful here. I was spelling it with all O's. So
I think like August 28th or something. End of August, I think, is when it comes out.
Is it one of those like whole season drops at once type of deals, or like?
No. We're getting away from that. But we should have a hot take on that. I miss those days of
all right.
Give me it all right now. I can binge it. Right. I don't want to wait till next Thursday to see the next one.
I lost it on my husband because he started Hijack with me. He's in charge of shows. That's his responsibility. So he started it, and it like the last episode that's available popped up and went, and I was like, that wasn't the end. And he goes, oh no, we started it before it's all out. And I was like, why would you do this to me? Right. It was a whole thing because we try to like pace ourselves so that we do start shows when they're all out. But it's really hard, especially with things like what you're talking about, because like Mandalorian, that was, impossible to wait for. So
all right. In that case, since we're doing good.
I was just going to say, I am so pumped to see Thrawn in like live series, but I'm also a little bit scared that they might screw it up because he's like such a good character. Well, he's like the best in the written books. Like Thrawn is like the best character Star Wars has ever done, but he's never been in like a feature.
But I think TV. So far they haven't really messed things up, right? Like they've been doing good, so it should be fine. Now you're working.
We'll see.
That sounds like another show.
Hot take show.
Yeah.
Another pick would be The Witcher, season 3, the first part, or I guess it's 4. No, there's 3. but the first part dropped. The next part comes out next week.
Yeah.
Excellent. Good show.
So it was like a time to release, but it was like, we'll give you 50% now and we'll give you 50% later.
I'm gonna give you one last Star Wars thing.
Oh.
I can talk about Star Wars all day, but like if you're a Star Wars fan or you love Star Wars, you want some more Star Wars, and you haven't watched Star Wars Rebels, I recommend watching it. It's a slow burn, but as it gets deeper and deeper, the story is amazing, and it's so well worth the watch. So like, see it through and go
Is it
watch
for
it. If you haven't
any?
watched it.
Is it for any age group or no?
Yes. Isn't
Yeah,
Star Wars for
I think
any
so.
age group? I mean, you know.
Well, and watching Rebels will definitely increase your enjoyment of the Ahsoka series, because you could already tell that there's like so many threads from Rebels that they pick up on with
that's
the Ahsoka
awesome.
series.
And it
Cool.
started on Disney Plus, and so it kind of was like, you know, this be kind of kid friendly. I mean, Star Wars is always supposed to be kid friendly. I think we get all caught up, and another show. We'll talk about another show. But like, it starts out kind of like, you know, kid kind of friendly, but then the story gets, you know, just slow burn again. Like each season, the story just gets amazing to me. So
Is it
watch
all?
it.
Is it done or is it still?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's all done. Get that Disney Plus subscription and go.
Wouldn't
binge
be
it.
a good episode, Bill, if there weren't at least 8 fights. So thank you, chat, so much. All of you have been amazing with your comments and your questions and your support for this hot take episode. And Justin, again, thank you so much for all that you do for us. We appreciate you, man. I think that's a wrap, unless anyone has closing words. We're gonna hear from our sponsors and then cut it. But have a marvelous Friday, everybody. It was so good seeing you all. Angular Air is sponsored by Kendo UI for Angular. We have over 100 components built from the ground up in Angular, or each framework and library that it's built for. So not only do we have Angular on the JavaScript side, but we have Kendo UI for React, jQuery, and Vue as well. And if you're on the .NET side of life, we have things for Blazor, Maui, WPF, and so much more. All of our libraries are themable, customizable, and of course come with killer professional support. So try it out for free today at kendoui.com.